So let's talk now about how we're going to demonstrate our candidacy via the resume. So here are some essential things to note. Unlike the Canadian market, you only get a one-page resume to submit, not 2 pages. Following this workshop presentation, I will circulate a template to everyone who's registered. So you can see what that New York template looks like, and I'll show you samples of it here in the following slides. I want to remind everybody that the resume is not the same thing as a curriculum vitae. Who can tell me what the difference is between a resume versus a CV or curriculum vitae? They're not the same thing, so what makes them different? Does anyone know? We've got 50 people in the room in one of the most rigorous academic programs in the world. Can anyone tell me the difference between a resume and a CV? Okay, so Charmaine says a CV includes research completed. Yes, that's partly true. Specific to the firm, okay, no, none of these are right. Exactly, so let me tell you. A curriculum vitae is literally the compendium of every work experience, including publications, that you've ever done in your life. It is the entire summary of all of the experiences cumulatively that you have. It can go on for pages and pages and pages. It can include everything from your work experience as a teenager through undergrad, masters, etc. It can be curated for specific firms, but a curriculum vitae is really the full body of work that you have done throughout your life. A resume is exactly what it sounds like. It's a summary. Think about a museum collection. The Louvre in France will display maybe 10% of their total collection, and 90% of what the Louvre has is actually in their vaults in the basement. And once in a while, they'll say, okay, we need to curate a new exhibit. Let's say it's Egyptian or Greek gods from this era to this era, and specifically featuring women. And they'll pick, the 10 or 20 objects that fit the criteria for that exhibit, and they'll put them on display based on what the market demand is and what types of exhibits are likely to sell. Similarly, your resume is simply the highlights. It's the curated set of information that the firm needs to know in order to make a reasonable decision about whether or not they want to hire you. It does not include every work experience you've ever had. It doesn't even include everything you did under each work experience. It's purely the information in one page that a firm would need in order to make an educated decision about whether or not you are the right fit. Is that clear? So for every 10 jobs, you're maybe only picking 3 and highlighting the most salient elements under each that are transferable to what New York is looking for. So it's a one-page resume. Now, for a lot of people who haven't worked and who have done kindergarten straight through to JD, you could probably end up using one page to put all of your work experience on, 3 or 4 or 5 work experiences. But for those of you who are mature candidates or who did a master's or had several years of work experience before, you're basically curating a very narrow set of highlighted work experiences that New York would care about. The other thing to note about your resume is that it should focus on your academic background. You want to incorporate all of your bar admissions if you have any master's, undergraduate degree programs and certificates you have, including law school. It should obviously involve any substantial work experience. To the extent possible, you should be highlighting quantitative metrics, and we'll get into that next. So not just qualitative things that you've done, but what the value impact of that is. And you want to demonstrate in your interest section that you have diversity of interests and skills. So there's a section right at the bottom that we'll look at now that has a space for you to really show your personality. So let's take a look at this. And like I said, I'll circulate the actual template that you guys can populate. So you'll notice that the top portion of your resume will lead with your education section. So you'll want the name of your undergraduate institution, your master's degree institution, and your law school. And you'll want to include these sections underneath it that highlight the extracurriculars relevant to the degree that you are pursuing. So the journal that you were part of in law school, the moot competition you were part of, whether you got honors, and the leadership roles you were in. These little subheadings under each of your education experiences are optional. So for example, under undergraduate studies, you'll notice it says thesis. If you didn't write a thesis, don't use that row, delete that. If you didn't get honors, delete that. If you don't have room, Remove your GPA. They can see it on your resume. So these are just options for you to play with based on the amount of space that's available. Why we set it up this way is because sometimes there's a section on the Toronto resume where your activities are in a separate section, but it creates more work for a New York employer to have to figure out, well, when they said they were president of the South Asian Students Association, was that undergrad or law school? You don't want to make them do the work. So it's more concise and easy to follow when the extracurriculars are lumped under the education. It just makes more sense of the narrative. The next piece to the resume after the education portion is work experience. You'll also notice that there's a community service portion. Typically, if you have more than 2 or 3 jobs that you are putting on here, community service is the thing to delete altogether to create more room for work experience. And instead, what you'll do with community service is you'll put it as a bullet underneath one of your educations. So for example, if your community service work is volunteering for a legal not-for-profit and you're a board member, you would just put that under activities under law school if you did it while you're in law school, rather than putting it here. It depends on how substantial it is. So under your work experience, this is the format you will use, and I will go into how I would grade a resume from D, C, B, and A, and what this criteria should look like. The section that you cannot delete is languages, skills, and interests. If you don't have any languages, you don't put it there. Don't waste room just writing English. They kind of know you've done a degree in English, that's expected. But if you have certifications, if you have special interests, if you have hobbies, if you have sports teams you're part of, that's what you want to put in that final section. It's one of the sections that's easiest to start a more soft conversation with. If I don't want to ask you about your grades, and I don't want to ask about your thesis, and I don't want to ask about what courses you liked in law school, and I just want to get to know you, the interest section is the first place I'll go. Oh, I see that you enjoy Middle Eastern cooking. Can you tell me about your favorite dish? Oh, we have amazing Middle Eastern restaurants here in New York. Let me tell you about it. It's an easy way for a conversation to flow. So here's a grading rubric I developed after seeing hundreds and hundreds of resumes to help you understand what a mediocre, a poor, and an excellent resume looks like. At the worst level, the D level, somebody will put down the mere statement of a task that they did in a job. This doesn't mean it's inaccurate information. That's not why it got a grade of D. It's just not very descriptive. So the basic statement of a task completed will always get a D grade from me because it will fail to contain sufficient detail or background for me to make the one assessment I have to make as a New York employer. Are you right for the job? If all you wrote down, for example, is that you worked at a law firm last summer and you reviewed documents and attended client meetings, yes or no, can I make an assessment as to whether you did that well and you're an A+ student and an A+ candidate, or whether you're mediocre? Is this a sufficient differentiator for me? Yes or no? Drop it in the chat. Can I differentiate on the basis of reviewed documents and attended client meetings? No, 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 no. Excellent. That's why it's shit. That's why it's D. I love you guys, but you have no idea how many times I've seen this written down and someone tell me, but that's what I did. Fine. But you're not helping me make a decision about you, so you may as well have written nothing. So let's upgrade this. Let's go from a D to a C. Let's figure out what that takes. So a C level is where you provide now some detail and context to qualify those basic tasks you completed. The example here is reviewed complex lease agreements, supply chain contracts, and attended high-profile client meetings as part of the real estate team at XYZ firm. Okay, so you didn't just review documents, you reviewed lease agreements. What kind of lease agreements? Complex ones. You also reviewed supply chain contracts as part of a real estate team. Okay, so now I have practice area specialty. And you didn't just attend any client meeting. These were high-profile client meetings. And what that says to me is you now have client-facing skills. Do you see how much more information I can extrapolate about you simply by adding a few of these descriptors? Yes? Is that clear? Drop it in the chat. Is this clear? Good. Excellent. That's still a C, though. So it's good. It's just not great. So here's how we're going to up-level once again. The more you can provide me with scope scale, and metrics, the easier it is for me to objectively evaluate the complexity that you purport to describe. You've simply said qualitatively, I worked on complex lease agreements. Okay, great. Maybe that's according to you. Maybe I would find them simple, but it's hard to argue with numbers. So when you, in example B, tell me I reviewed over 100 lease agreements and supply chain contracts, I'm giving you a lot more credit now for having refined your level of intricacy of understanding, because you didn't just review one or two. By the time you reviewed 100 lease agreements, you've developed some specialization and expertise. And you didn't just attend those client meetings. You presented the findings of what you did in that review to clients in high profile meetings. Okay, so you don't just have client facing skills, you have advocacy skills too. And you have analytical skills because you're able to walk somebody through what you found. And you weren't just part of a real estate deal team, you were part of the real estate deal team that serviced the largest acquisition of Canadian real estate in history. So you've dealt with one of a kind cases at the highest level where the stakes were sufficiently, where there was enough skin in the game and the stakes were high. That gives me a lot more information about whether you're prepared for the big leagues in New York. And yet that's still a B. So what I expect of each and every one of you, if you're submitting to New York, is to get to the A level. And that's where we don't only emphasize scale, scope, size, complexity, and context. We have one special feature that makes a B bullet into an A bullet. And that one thing is the so what factor. How did you go above and beyond to create value for the client? So I reviewed 100 complex lease agreements and supply chain contracts for potential liabilities. So you weren't just reviewing it passively, you were looking for liabilities. Then you presented those findings in the high profile client meeting, which saved the client $300 million on the largest real estate acquisition in Canada. Bingo. So by hiring you, our clients will save money. By hiring you, I don't worry about putting you in front of clients or running point on significant deals like the largest acquisition of Canadian real estate in history. By hiring you, I'm going to get a lot of work churned out, like 100+ lease agreements. Now, am I ready to hire you for New York? Yes or no? Drop it in the chat or say it out loud. Am I ready to hire you now? Cameron says yes. Yusuf says yes. Perfect. That's what we're looking for. They should have to do as little work as possible to arrive at a clear and resounding decision that you are who they need to hire. So the key takeaways are this. Hiring committees are composed of experienced individuals who are able to detect substance from padding. Be direct and don't cover up perceived weaknesses. Use any gaps in your timeline or areas that are less substantive as one starting point for your narrative. Explain why there was a gap in your timeline. Explain what you were doing. What detail can you offer in your interview, for example, to turn those gaps into a strength? Or how could you address it in your cover letter? Decide on what your narrative or your brand is going to be, and then decide how you're going to curate your resume to highlight that brand. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Remember that the one-page resume is a highly curated snapshot into your world and allows you to frame your narrative strategically. Finally, for those who have not as much work experience, the one-page opportunity puts you on the same level as your peers who may have 2 to 3 pages of content. So don't worry if you feel like I don't have a lot of work experience. The one pager is actually, it levels the field a little bit. So that's a good thing. And if you have a lot of work experience, that's not a downside either. It just means you'll have to curate a bit more intentionally. Any questions at this stage?